Yeah, so this event will be recorded. If you don't feel comfortable being recorded, go ahead and turn your camera off. But yeah, with that being said, Alex, go ahead and share your amazing knowledge with us.
Yeah, so hi everybody. Thank you for having me. Alex Ghenis, he, him, in Oakland on Ohlone land as well. So I guess I'll give a kind of quick intro to what I do in my work. I was in the nonprofit sphere for a while, and now I'm doing kind of some freelance work, but my main focus for the past almost decade, and I went to Cal and then graduated and got into a lot of this work, is about how people with disabilities will be affected by climate change. So I'll talk about and kind of walk through things. The overarching thing that really I'm hoping to drive home here today is that disability is a very wide tent and climate change is a very wide tent. So when we look at disability and climate change, it's important to recognize you've got nearly infinite kind of nodes of connection, right? Between individuals, locations, climate impacts, intersectionality, et cetera. So today I'm just going to kind of introduce a framework of how to think about these issues. I understand that a lot of you here have done some kind of little research on some of those more specific interactions and connections, and I'd love to hear about those as we get kind of farther along into the presentation and the Q&A. But yeah, that's me, and I will start sharing my screen now. So again, this presentation is going to be about disability rights and climate justice. As I said, my name is Alex Ghenis. My little consulting gig here is called Accessible Climate Strategies. Feel free to check out the website. I'm sure you all are not looking for clients, but it's got a blog and a lot of resources and a lot of very useful links. I kind of tried to build it out to be similar to some nonprofit websites, as well as showing what I do, my partners. So basically here is, I'm just going to get right rolling to it because I'd love to have a conversation at the end to make sure that we have enough time. But when we're looking at the connections between disability and climate change, here's the first broad tent, is that disability is very diverse. So you can see people with disabilities are roughly, it's say between 15 and 20% of the global population, depending on who you talk to, how you define disability, and how people identify personally, whether they're able to say that they identify with a disability. Generally, we say it's about 20%, so 1 in every 5 people has some sort of disability. And when we say disability, these come into broad categories. And so you could have physical disability would be one of them. And these are kind of buckets that a lot of us in the disability rights community use to simplify things. It's also what a lot of governments use to simplify their research and how they kind of distribute services out. So you've got physical disability, you might have blind, low vision, you might have, deaf, hard of hearing. You could have intellectual disability, psychological disability, which is one certainly isn't addressed enough in the United States. And then within those categories, you have specific medical conditions and related needs. So you can see me here with this little plastic thing on my hand. I have a C5-6 spinal cord injury, so I broke my neck when I was a teenager. And I have limited movement in my arms, no movement in my fingers. So there's a specific medical condition. I have related needs. People help me out during the day. This little thing is a need. My wheelchair is a need for kind of independence and well-being. This just, boom, philosophical idea is you can say needs and wants, and there's kind of a blurry section in that Venn diagram, which I think some of us in the United States haven't fully digested, is how needs and wants are perceived really around the world and in different communities here. Anyways, that's that. And I'll say, me with my disability, I do not have the same experience as somebody else with the exact same level of spinal cord injury. So there's people's kind of, I don't know, medical and personal connections and relations to their disability. This bottom left-hand corner here, talking about intersections, certainly at Cal, I know there's a lot of discussions about intersectionality and how somebody with epilepsy who is a child, a teenager, is going to have a very different experience than someone who acquires epilepsy when they're a little bit older. Gender certainly has different intersectionalities in the way that it affects people's lives, race, income, location, the list could go on here. People might have trouble with their own identity, identifying as someone with a disability, and they might have difficulty either acquiring or really just saying like, okay, I'm comfortable getting these accommodations. Somebody might have a more beneficial independent life if they work with care attendants, but if they can't really kind of swallow that pill and say, okay, I'm going to give up a little bit of my pride in order to, or my previous identity as someone who's able-bodied, in order to get this thing that'll help me, that's a barrier that we encounter sometimes in the disability community. And in such a rushed time frame as addressing climate issues, it's something we keep in mind. And then when you get to disability as diverse, and we'll get to this in the next few slides, but local climate impacts and relative preparedness of those people with disabilities is something that's important, right? So here in California, our biggest climate impacts are going to be drought, wildfire, extreme heat events, smoke, and now power outages that are somewhat related to climate change. Someone here in California, if they have a disability and they're aware of their disability needs, they might have a backup generator in case we have one of those public safety power shutoff events. They might be more aware of their needs in terms of preparedness and address it accordingly. Somebody else might not, and then they'd be in more of a pickle should a climate event or event happen. The next thing to look at here is the medical model versus the social model of disability. And the medical model says that pretty much being able-bodied is normal and other people are inferior. Anyone with any sort of disability is inferior to this kind of ideal able-bodied person. And you can add on other levels of privilege to that if you want. And disability is treated medically. So if someone has a disability, it's viewed through a medical lens, and the whole idea is to cure that person and bring them back as close to the able-bodied norm. There's not very much effort as accessibility. And when, say, doctors, et cetera, focus on a piece of adaptive equipment, they don't view that as accessibility. They view that as like a medical accommodation almost. It's hard to see how that makes sense, or it's a nuance compared to some of the other ways to look at it, but it's important. And really what I say here is you are broken, not the system. Is the way that the system speaks to people with disabilities under that model. Actually, the disability rights movement started in Berkeley, and it led to kind of the blossoming of this social model of disability, which says that, listen, throughout the world, we have a range of abilities and disabilities. Anybody's status could change. One of the famous quotes of a disability rights leader here in Berkeley is that we are the only minority that doesn't discriminate because anybody could join our crew at any time, which really, is the truth. And so you say there's a range of abilities, anybody's status could change, and the goal is to have inclusion, people living, say, out in the community instead of in a nursing home, and independence, and providing the services to help people being independent. They use principles of universal access and design, saying go beyond, the concrete kind of numbers, et cetera, of, say, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and make it so that everything is as universally accessible as possible. A doorbell also comes with a flashing light, right? Things that people might not think about. Flashing light probably wouldn't bother very people much at all, but it's incredibly useful for someone who's blind or deaf or hard of hearing that moves into a home or in, say, an office building. And then says, provide the economic empowerment and supports for people to then be included and have independent life. And it says that the system is broken on me, right? That the system doesn't provide the access. And the kind of example that I use here is the medical model. If you have a building that has only stairs, right? No escalator, no elevator. The medical model says that's fine because it's built for able-bodied people. And Alex, it's your fault you can't go up the stairs because your legs don't work to go up it. The social model says there isn't a ramp or an elevator, and that's the issue. Actually, the way that we look at it is the medical model then says, Alex, you are disabled because you can't walk up the stairs. Social model says the lack of an elevator is what is disabling me, right? It's the inaccessible system that is causing my disability. Now, the reality is that real world falls somewhere in the middle. If there's only so many jobs out there, I'm not going to pretend that, I can do a bunch of manual labor stuff, right? Like that's just a straight up barrier and I'm kind of disabled from doing that. But on the other hand, you've got the elevator issue, you've got the reasonable accommodations, you've got, the disabled students program that provides things like note takers at UC Berkeley. And gives people an education that then gives them earning potential, that then gives them money in case there's a storm that hits, right? And then they have a few more bucks in the bank to be able to withstand that storm. Like all of this is so interconnected. I'm being all philosophical right now. Hopefully y'all can catch up. But me saying the real world is somewhere in the middle. When we say, are we vulnerable? The medical model says 100% yes with 0 accommodations. The social model says 100% no because you provide every accommodation and then somebody isn't vulnerable. And then reality is, still yes, just not 100%. This is a term that the term vulnerable is really tricky within the disability community. I'd encourage everybody to be careful when you're going out and speaking with disability advocates because vulnerable really has kind of a negative connotation. It says that, yeah, we are in this negative sphere where we can't easily evacuate, as opposed to, evacuation plans don't take into account wheelchair accessible vans on a short time frame, right? It also pretends like that vulnerability really is kind of immutable. It can't be addressed or overcome or made to disappear by providing accommodations, et cetera. Okay, so here we go. So let me move to the next step, which is looking at climate change's primary and secondary impacts and examples and impacts on people with disabilities. So when we look at climate change, primary impacts would be like an acute crisis, maybe a long-term drought, something like a forest fire, a storm, rising sea levels, then damaging infrastructure, et cetera. And then you've got kind of cascading impacts. And I'll touch on these in a little bit. So acute crisis would be a primary impact. An acute crisis could lead to disability. It could create more disability. For example, somebody gets injured in a storm, somebody gets heat stroke, and then has post-stroke symptoms after an extreme heat event. Evacuation and shelter is often difficult or inaccessible for many people with disabilities. And this is something that policy-wise has been kind of we've made progress, but there's a balance between how much do people need to look out for themselves and how much can the government do, what can the government do to do better. If there's a disaster, you're going to have a disruption in services or even the delivery of, say, medications, of the availability of paratransit. People might get kind of stranded or not get their medical or personal care needs met. There can be financial concerns during crisis and recovery. I think we all know about the economic troubles in the United States, how few people have enough money in the bank to withstand a personal crisis without going into debt. Many people with disabilities are economically disadvantaged. This is just kind of a statistical thing, like the levels of employment are lower than they are. The labor force participation is like half of what it is for able-bodied folks. For the disability population, and if you're on benefits, you can't have very much money in the bank, otherwise you lose your health care. So you've got people where if there is a disaster, they might not have the resources to navigate that, and they might be relying really on charity and safety net from government. There can be communication barriers. Someone shows up to a disaster shelter and they are deaf, and you need to figure out a way to kind of overcome that communication barrier. So economic damage, certainly we can see this, with Texas and the power grid, that's gonna affect them economically for quite a while. People with disabilities are already economically disadvantaged. It will exacerbate inequality when there is economic problems, which will hit our community. There are, in general, fewer accessible jobs that you can do with modifications, really office jobs and things like that. So if the economy has trouble, employers might kind of their ableism in hiring might kick up that much more, right? Because there's more applicants and then they just discount people with disabilities. So then there's going to be shrinking government budgets and austerity. I'll in the next slide, I'll talk about COVID as a case study. But certainly you could see that with COVID, which is related to our interaction with nature, you could say it's somewhat climate related, has made it so that now we need to do a large federal bailout for cities and states. And if we didn't have that, and we're already incredibly stressed, people might lose access to those care attendants, that Medicaid, whatever it might be. And then finally, stigma against, quote unquote, needy and unproductive people during times of extreme economic stress happens, and need to look out for ableism and even like dangerous violent ableism in that situation. Conflict, we have water wars, we know about those. We have wars over arable land. Sometimes if there's migration from a storm or hurricane, it can create just tensions there and lead to conflict and violence. Certainly, there can be disability in conflict from injuries, disease, PTSD, whatever it might be. There's disrupted goods and services in war zones, war crimes concerns that people with disabilities tend to be more exposed to war crimes, infrastructure damage, impacts accessibility, are barriers to leaving, and therefore difficulty as a refugee. If you need to go over long distances, but you have acute medical needs, that's really, really darn tough. And some places, actually, I'll go to the next column here with migration, is that there are barriers. So accessible transportation, personal and medical needs. There's limited immigration categories and denial. So often immigration, if it's not, say, a refugee situation, they will have job quotas, they'll have work-related visas, but not so much people with disabilities. And then sometimes they might even deny because of the perception that someone with a disability will use government benefits and be kind of more of a cost to the government. It might have difficulty accessing jobs and housing, and then getting government services. And actually, this isn't even across countries, right? This could happen within the United States. If you get displaced from a hurricane and have to hop over to the next state and you're on Medicaid, you might not be able to easily use that Medicaid in the next state. So even here in the US, there are pieces of legislation waiting in DC to address things like that because they're ongoing problems. Next, COVID as a case study. I'm going to try to pound through this so that we have at least 10 minutes of conversation time. But COVID as a case study, we know 10 to 30% of people have long haul COVID. which pretty much is a year-long disabling event. There's some hope that they're figuring out how to address that medically. Many people with disabilities are disproportionately impacted medically. Actually, California just now opened up vaccine appointments to people with pre-existing conditions and disabilities. It was just age and then like labor category before that. Congregate and medical settings are hotspots. Far too many people with disabilities are still institutionalized in nursing homes and other places that have, their petri dishes, really. And we saw that being an issue. Economic inequality exacerbates the impact of a pandemic. Again, we're talking about the K-shaped recovery. There are budget crunches and austerity concerns. I think a lot of us are really grateful about the American Rescue Plan that just passed. And then there is increasing eugenic ideology rhetoric. You saw that out of Texas with pretty much like grandma die for the Dow. And we don't want to keep seeing that. It's dangerous. There's things about, people in good health will be just fine and great for them, but there's not everybody is in good health, right? So for mitigation, there's just a couple more slides here. Things to think about as you go forward. So mitigation is, reducing or reversing warming. Through natural or, engineered processes. So when you're doing this, you kind of go in. There's a lot of very ambitious people with really great technologies and policy ideas. So you either create them or seek them out, what those new mitigation efforts are. Within the organization doing those efforts, I would say train and hire people with disabilities. PWDs there is people with disabilities, because there's so much to be said about representation matters, and having that internal diversity experience and knowledge is really powerful for companies and entities focusing on mitigation. Next is to consult with the disability community, do interviews, surveys, focus groups, and then identify shortcomings and opportunities coming out of that consultation, coming out of, say, assorted research that someone might do. Then redesign for universal access and multiple uses. When I say universal access, I mean making it so that, say, a automated vehicle can be accessible for a wheelchair to go in, can have automatic hooks to hook in a wheelchair, so that someone with a physical disability can use it all the way, as well as has, say it's cell phone app operated, that the cell phone app, they make sure that it works for people who are blind, low vision, and have their phone speak to them, right? So there's that. And then multiple uses is simply to make it more efficient. We have limited time, we have limited resources, we have limited energy and effort. So multiple uses is fantastic. So yay, thumbs up to that. And then finally, support people with disabilities through awareness, advertising, and affordability. Actually, something I'm thinking about here when it says multiple uses, let me give one anecdote, would be distributing solar panels and battery packs to people with disabilities' homes, right? Helping them be microgrids. You can be a more efficient electric grid with lower carbon emissions that way. And if there's a power outage because of fires happening or because there's too much load on the California grid, people with disabilities who have, say, a ventilator, where if that thing shuts off, they're dead. I know these are serious things we're talking about here, but that person then in an emergency will have backup power to help them stay alive, right? You're doing both mitigation and preparation / adaptation / resilience, both in the same bucket. And then that last one is support people with disabilities through awareness, advertising, and affordability. Do active engagement of the disability community as opposed to a bunch of PSAs. Use multiple media for different learning styles and sensory abilities. Next is going to be adaptation. So I say identify the scale and scope of the things you're focusing on, of the climate disability interaction. You know, what kind of disability categories are you talking about? What kind of geography are you talking about? Are you talking about the city of Berkeley? Are you talking about a neighborhood in Berkeley? You know, say, what are we going to do with uh, housing near the North Berkeley BART station, right? Because housing is related to adaptation. You build more apartments, then if some homes burn in the woods and the hills, people can move into the apartments and those are available. Like you could talk about that. You could talk about how we are going to, you know, Berkeley is switching from natural gas infrastructure to electric infrastructure. So what's that going to look like in that city? Or are you looking at a much larger geography, California, even a county level or national or global? And then the time frame of the effort that you want to take. And I always say, be realistic in that respect. Then look at the climate impacts, primary and secondary impacts that you want to focus on, kind of build that web, that network. Look at effects on the built environment, disability services, accessibility, et cetera, from those climate impacts. Then identify shortcomings and areas of need to safeguard the well-being of people with disabilities, engage them in the process, and hopefully make it so that they almost end up better on the other side of this if possible. And then have inclusive resilience and reinforcement actions. So make sure that they keep on going with all of that. One note I'd like to make both on mitigation and adaptation is it's a lot cheaper to make something universally accessible and inclusive right off the bat than it is to do a retrofit later on. And in the USA, we have a couple of laws on the books that makes it much easier to sue someone when they do it wrong. So not only is it cost effective, it also saves some legal bills and things like that. So I say, you know, idealism or realism, the post-industrial utopia of a, you know, a tree in the woods with a permaculture garden is all good and well for people who can farm on their own and people that don't need access to modern medicine. It's simply going to be impossible for some people with disabilities. That tree house is not physically accessible. You know, who knows what it's like to move out there. So we need to be realistic about that. And I think that people with disabilities have felt to some extent kind of uh, um, you know, there's the not included, not considered, etc. In the environmental movement because they saw things like this and said, you know what, that's too ableist for me. There's ableist assumptions there. And then here's another ableist assumption, is Berkeley's straw ban, which was all good and well, except for the people with disabilities who can't hold a cup on their own easily and need straws. So, you know, a quick kind of good faith thing that didn't really keep into account that there are people here in our community that need straws. And it happened so quickly that it was kind of a rush from the Berkeley disability community simply over this one policy. So always to, again, consult with the disability community before implementing any policy to make sure that, you know, it won't negatively impact them. And here's the damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I was mentioning the fires and power outages. You know, in Paradise, when they had that fire, some 75 of the 80 something people that passed away were seniors. And there's a huge correlation between age and disability and often using similar supports and services. So in fires, people with disabilities can't easily evacuate. And then we learned that those fires were caused by transmission lines, and now PG&E is not providing electricity in some situations. And you have people with disabilities who are you know, who use ventilators, who use an elevator, who use a cell phone to communicate with a care attendant that don't have those services and accommodations anymore. And this, you know, it's really frustrating for the community, and it drives home that we need to be vigilant and plan in advance and then maintain, you know, whatever infrastructure and equipment we have, so we don't have to do this decade-long public safety power shutoff issue. Finally, closing thoughts is number one, always include disability in any human rights and vulnerability assessments. Utilize the social model wherever possible, but again, recognize that the social model is not a cure-all. And here, mitigation also is not a cure-all, but it buys time for adaptation. And both of those would disproportionately benefit kind of already under-supported communities and communities that are, what you would call vulnerable here. There's a large need for policy intervention and public education, both for the public saying, hey, disability matters here, and for the disability community say, hey, this is a very important topic for you all to focus on, and let's see how we can work together. And then public education around, okay, here's how you prepare a personal disaster plan, or here are some considerations you might want to have in terms of making sure that your house is safeguarded against sea level rise, whatever it might be, right? Accessible design and construction is better than retrofits and reforms later on. Government should support personal readiness and adaptation. Consider putting together and giving people go bags that also has space for medications and some medical supplies, but that's still not enough to rely, to tell people, okay, here's a go bag and you're on your own. So engage experts and the disability community. And there's this last bullet point, which is nothing about us without us, which is a common refrain of the disability activist community. So, reach out. There's organizations all over the place representing people with disabilities. So thank you. I think that's that. And I will stop sharing and do some discussion. Cool. I'm going to drink some water. Wow. Okay. So questions, where would I be able to access the presentation slides? I can send those over to Nassim, and then you work with folks. Do you think we can reach a social model expectation of 100% no vulnerability? I would love to say yes, but no, we can't. Here's an example. Me personally, with my disability, in incredibly hot temperatures, I can't sweat to cool myself down. And I have limited lung capacity just because I can only use my diaphragm and not my chest muscles. So if there is an extreme heat event, the social model would say, ensure that you have accessible housing with air conditioning, or that you have accessible cooling shelters with like air-conditioned transportation to get there. That's not always available, and I don't think that we're going to be able to provide that to everybody. And then if I say, hey, I want to go to the cafe 5 blocks away, but it's 100 degrees out, my able-bodied friend would be able to go over there, probably sweat at the brow a little bit, but I'm going to struggle. So, I wish I could say we could. I think we always have to recognize that, yes, there are medical, like, disproportionate vulnerability to this. We should do whatever possible to kind of reduce those barriers. So, what is some common ableist rhetoric that is present in climate organizing spaces? I don't think it's explicitly ableist so much as discounting the seriousness of the needs of people with disabilities, or discounting disability as a demographic and social group deserving of social justice efforts. So if that makes sense, I think we have a lot of gender and race and ethnicity and immigration status and nationality, but disability is kind of forgotten on the back burner. And then it's too quick to say things like we can't have any disposable plastics anywhere. When I can think of me and my friends with disabilities, most of us have been in the hospital one way or another. Not all of us, but a lot of us have had overnight stays, and you just see how much disposable plastic is there, and it's like, okay, great, but how am I going to get an IV of saline if we get rid of disposable plastics? So there's that. There's talk about getting rid of the industrial everything entirely, and again, doing that is just not going to work. And I think there's a sense that if you were to really push climate advocates and use that, hey, so what are you going to do with the people that need um, plastic derived from oil that we need to figure out what in the world to do with it afterward, or that need medications that are somewhat derived from chemicals that are like pulled out of, natural gas, whatever it might be. What are you going to do with us? And I think that if you push them, it would just be a shrug. We don't know, at best, if not we need to shrink the human population and maybe the people that are consuming the most, sorry about that, guys. So, there is that rhetoric, or just absent-mindedness, right? I know some persons with disabilities use packaged foods because they have a difficult time preparing their own food as we move away from plastic use. How do you think that sustainable eating can be designed for disabled people? Uh, you know, um, uh, Paper takeout stuff, I don't see it's a big issue, right? Um, uh, Plastics are a big, like, I've got no darn, plastics are one that hang over my head. I recognize the environmental damage that comes from the creation and disposal of plastic products. But, there are alternatives, to things like plastic straws. There's paper straws. They need to design better ones with hinges on them. There are, paper food containers. There are people with disabilities or whoever else could bring reusable containers. You could go to centers for independent living and then do distribution of reusable containers, and encourage those. Like, these are not impossible things to overcome, but it's difficult. It really is. And I know I wish I had all the answers and solutions, but a lot of it is just giving ideas to work through. How can we consult with and ask for help from the disability community on new policies / ideas without overburdening them and over relying on their help? Yep. How can we educate and inform ourselves on their needs if they don't have capacity to help or are unresponsive about issues we'd like feedback on? This is more specific to work on campus. There are disability organizations. There's the Disabled Students Union, things like that that you could reach out to and connect with. And yeah, if they're too busy, they're too busy, right? If you want, email me, or there's other people that work in the space. You can do that. This is, I think, one of the issues around climate justice for oppressed and under recognized and under resourced communities is there's so much other crap going on that it's hard to focus on this issue. And then the disability community is very engaged in like the public safety power shutoffs, but that's because it's like a very ever-present acute issue, and I'm not sure how much our community would have been engaged 10 years ago if someone came up to us and said, hey, I'm noticing that PG&E isn't trimming trees around these power lines, and we think it's going to disproportionately impact you. If you can frame that about, hey, we're playing the long game and we want some allies, and like we don't want to leave you behind, that's kind of some tough phrasing. Maybe don't want to leave you behind. Use more positive language, right? Use language like, we recognize that there's climate justice issues, the disability community, you can say I, or I and fellow climate activists haven't reached out as much. Can I invite you into the space? Can we have a conversation? I statements are really powerful. I'm remembering back to my Cal days and how much we included and used those in groups, etc. So, speak from the heart, reach out, recognize that people might be too busy and there's a lot going on. Communicate, I'd say communicate about the long game because this is a decades-long effort and it's going to be an ongoing effort. Okay, are there any orgs and or activists who we can learn from to get more informed and to help us incorporate disability justice meaningfully in our environmental work? Um, uh, you know, uh, there's some international coalitions. I would say, actually, Victor Pineda, who's a professor on campus, would be a really great person to reach out to look at those orgs. I have a list of some orgs and resources on my website, which was there at the beginning of the presentation. So feel free to go there, and there's like a disability resources thing over in the corner. And then what is the history of local and state governments accommodating disabled folks during climate crises, earthquakes, wildfires, and COVID? Were there any concrete actions taken to help the community? I mean, there's a, oh God, what's the name of this? I think it's getting it wrong. It's either getting it wrong or getting it right. I should know which one, but there's a paper that came out from a global disaster readiness coalition of people with disabilities that was just really critical of pretty much everything, right? When they try to set up phone registries for paramedics to go find people that sometimes might even do more harm than good, because folks are a little bit too complacent and expect that the paramedics are just going to show up, right? The fire department's just going to show up. People get stranded when the Oroville spillway collapsed 4 years ago. Like we had horror stories of, these entire town just like hoofed it out of there, worried about a giant flood for a couple of weeks. And there were some people that were stuck in their homes for 3 or 4 days, like desperately trying to get in touch with caregivers and the rest. It hasn't been good. COVID is better because they are starting to really recognize and prioritize people with disabilities as a group that needs that support. There has been now with the public safety power shutoffs and like backup generators and batteries, there's been more outreach and support there. So there are some good examples for the most part. There are more bad stories than good. I know it's 51. Should I do this last one or do you think, I don't know, Naseem, Jed?
Yeah, we can keep continuing with Q&A. Yeah, I think that would be okay. I think I just left the last few minutes for you to answer more questions with folks.
Yeah. Well, here, what are your thoughts? The last question here is, what are your thoughts on making difficult trails in nature parks more accessible to folks with disabilities, while also respecting the outdoors wildlife habitats? You're gonna need paved areas, and there are only so many pieces of paved trails that you go. I think a lot of people with disabilities, the ones that have really kind of digested their own disability and gone through their life and accepted it. Most of us are like, all right, there's only so many accessible hiking trails, but I'll go and find them. So that's good. Consult with the disability community. I was brought into a focus group for was it the Presidio in San Francisco about them like redoing some maps and trails to see was it accessible. And the ones that they had that were supposed to be accessible but still had some dirt were horrible. Like I ended up almost my chair tipped over twice. I basically after this focus group said, hey, I'm gonna look at the map and try to find my way around, and it wasn't there. So I think it's better to under promise and over deliver than overpromise and underdeliver in terms of accessibility, right? Tell people this trail is really, really, really darn accessible. Maybe look at another one and see what people say about if they would rate it accessible on a scale of 1 to 10, right? And otherwise accessible signage, stuff with Braille, audio instructions if need be, and yeah, cooling stations, considering we're getting more extreme heat events. I don't really think that a lot of people are going to go out hiking or, out for too much of a stroll if it's an extreme heat event, but never hurts. So, I don't know. Anything else from y'all?
There was another question about the orgs that Accessible Climate Strategies works with. So maybe if you wanted to share your screen and show us that list and talk about some of the groups.
Oh, the orgs that I work with?
Yeah, related to, disability justice.
Let's see. I think I have organizations here. So like, so like right here, you've got, so I've probably got more climate resources than disability resources. So climate resources, you can see, there's just some news, info on natural disasters, migration, conflict and economic impacts, and public health. And then for disability resources here, so international, Disability Rights International, World Enabled, UN Office on the High Commissioner of Human Rights and the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There's this UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a great framework document for disability rights if you're ever using something like that to argue for a disability rights effort. Cities for All is another one. Human Rights Watch has a thing on disability rights. There's more news organizations. United States, you've got the National Council on Independent Living is really great. There's independent living centers in every county across the country. Some serve multiple counties. And they just help people with disabilities live independently, and they would be really good for outreach, especially if you're doing a geographically focused effort to find the local independent living center and partner with them for outreach, for focus groups, whatever you might do. Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund and Disability Rights Advocates are both located in the Ed Roberts campus, which is sitting right on top of Ashby Bart. Ed Roberts was the founder of the modern disability rights movement and started it at Berkeley, actually. So we're like Disability Rights Central for that city. Disaster focused, you've got the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. Is really fantastic. They've got a lot of publications, including that Getting It Wrong one. This is the Ready for Disasters Act and the Disaster Relief Medicaid Act. So actually, DRMA was the one where if there's a federally declared emergency and you have Medicaid and you cross state borders, you can use your Medicaid services in the other state, right? This is that displacement migration sort of thing. So there are all laws going through, this would be cool to check out and see what works well. Then otherwise, California Foundation for Independent Living Centers, Disability Disaster Access and Resources, Disability Rights California, and then Olmsted Rights has a longer list of organizations and government agencies, including ones found in certain disability categories, which would be this whole longer list of resources right here. So that's that. We got, what, 2 more minutes?
Thank you. That was right on the dot. Like, we'll just have a couple minutes to close out. If there are any like lingering questions, feel free to like raise your hand or unmute yourself. But yeah, does anyone have any lingering questions? If not, you can always reach out to us. And yeah, thank you everyone for being present with us tonight. And thank you, Alex, for that wonderful presentation. Everyone who private messaged me their emails will receive the material. If you haven't already sent me your email, please do so. And I'll try to get the material out to you within the next few days. And yeah, I appreciate everyone who's been here and hope you have a wonderful night.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.